Part 3. Ben hadn't been outside in days. The city was still burning hot and he was sweating by the time he reached Kincaid's. The store was larger than he expected. Books spilled off shelves, covered tables, and teetered in piles. Sunshine poured in through front windows, lighting up the dust as it spiraled through the air. The air inside was cool and smelled like old paper. There was also the faint aroma of bread from the bakery next door. In the center of the store, a staircase rose to an overstuffed balcony. Every step was lined with more books. There were no customers, and no one behind the counter. The only sign of life was a sleeping black cat near the cash register. A battered clock hanging at an angle behind the counter said 4:15. Ben wiped his forehead with the inside of his shirt, then walked to the counter. Hello? Hello? He hoped he was speaking loudly. When no one emerged, he knocked on the counter. Still, no one answered. Only the cat responded, jumping to the floor and bolting up the stairs. Ben decided to follow the cat. Maybe the owner was upstairs. He climbed the steps. There didn't seem to be anyone around. He was thirsty and he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten. A wave of nausea passed through him, and for a moment he thought he might be sick right there on the stairs. He sat on the step and put his head between his knees. He thought about Jamie and took out his notebook. He flipped through the pages, looking at things Jamie had written. I just wanted you to stay and to be my friend. An icy blast from the air conditioner made Ben shiver. Slowly he lifted his head, unsure how long he should sit on the steps, waiting for someone to appear. Ben recognized the old woman as soon as she stepped through the door. She was the one who had stopped in front of the wolf diorama that day with Jamie. She wiped her face with a handkerchief as she walked up to an old man with round black glasses who had appeared behind the counter. She kissed him on the cheek. They didn't speak to each other, but their hands began to move, making all sorts of shapes and patterns. It took only a moment for Ben to figure out that they were using sign language. After a few exchanges, the old man turned his head toward the phone, held up one hand to the old woman, and then picked up the receiver. The old woman continued to sign with the old man while he spoke on the phone. Ben marveled at how the man could have two conversations at once. He figured that only the woman was deaf, since the man was using the phone. The couple kept signing after the old man hung up. At several points he and the old woman laughed. Ben was amazed by the speed of their hands and the pleasure in their faces. He didn't think he'd ever be able to sign that quickly, no matter how much he studied. He thought about the alphabet Jamie had taught him, but his mind went blank when he tried to remember the letters. Holding the notebook and pen in one hand, Ben started to stand, but his left leg had fallen asleep beneath him, and before he could brace himself it buckled and he toppled down the stairs. He landed on the floor with a hard thud amid an avalanche of books. Ben looked up into the terrified eyes of the old man and old woman. He groaned as they helped him sit up. The old man was speaking to him. Ben shook his head and pointed to his ears. I can't hear. When they began to sign, Ben shook his head again. I don't know sign language. Slowly, he looked around until he spotted the notebook and pen, which had fallen nearby. The old man retrieved them and wrote, Anything broken? Ben stretched his arm and legs and said, I don't think so. But he was rattled from the fall. May I have some water?" The old man nodded and disappeared into the back. Ben noticed that the old woman had become very still. She was studying him with the oddest expressions. It looked like confusion and wonder and sadness all at the same time. The old man returned with the water. As Ben drank it, he watched the old woman sign to the old man and then look back at Ben. She reached forward and touched the locket around Ben's neck. He glanced down and saw that it had opened. The old woman covered her mouth with her hand and then grabbed onto the old man. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She wiped her eyes with her handkerchief and then placed her hand on the side of Ben's face. Her thumb brushed momentarily across his skin. 1,000 questions ran through his mind, but before he could ask any of them, the old woman reached for the pen and notebook. Ben watched her trembling hand as if it held the pen over the paper before she began to write. She then turned to the pad so he could read what she had written. Ben? The old woman's hands were warm. She pulled Ben to her and held him tightly. What was going on? Ben pulled back and said, "How do you know my name?" The old woman seemed to be able to read his lips, but the old man also translated Ben's words into signs. The woman took the pen, pointed to herself, and wrote, "Rose." She pointed the pen toward the old man. "My brother, Walter." Ben asked again, "How do you know my name? Do you know my father?" Walter signed Ben's questions, and Rose wrote in the notebook, "Where's your mother?" Ben didn't know how to answer. It would take so long to explain. Then he remembered the pages he'd written for Jamie. He flipped back in the notebook and handed it to Rose. He rubbed the locket between his fingers and waited while she and Walter read his story. When they were done, Rose hugged Ben again. He resisted at first, but finally he let himself be held, and it was comforting, even from a stranger. Rose pulled back and wiped her eyes. "I'm so sorry about your mom," she wrote. "Do your aunt and uncle know where you are?" Ben shook his head. "They must be so worried. Write down their phone number." She gestured toward her brother and held her hand to her ear like a phone, indicating Walter would make the call. Ben wrote down the number, relieved that his aunt and uncle would finally know where he was and that he was safe. "How did you find us?" Rose wrote. Ben's pockets were full of stuff, but he rooted all around until he found the original bookmark and the new one from the dictionary Jamie had brought him. He unfolded them and handed them both to Rose. She and Walter read Danny's note to Elaine on the back of the first one. Then Ben reached into his back pocket and pulled out one more thing. As the old woman touched the book, Ben said again, "Please tell me how you know my name." Reading his lips, Rose wrote, "We met a long time ago." Except for the time in a museum a few days earlier, Ben was sure he'd never seen this woman before. "How did we meet?" Ben asked, as Walter translated. "When?" "It's a long story, but it starts here." Rose pointed to the red M opposite the title page of Wonderstruck. "Walter worked at the museum before he opened the store. He gave this book to me when I was young. I drew the roses and leaves, like a signature." "I don't understand. It's signed M, and you said your name is Rose." Rose turned to Walter, who translated the words she missed. "M is for mother," she wrote. "You are Danny's mother?" As Ben said the words, it dawned on him what this meant. Rose's face somehow changed before his eyes. Her skin, her white hair, and her slender fingers no longer belonged to a stranger. He wrote, "You're my grandmother?" Rose wiped the tears from her eyes and smiled. Ben hugged her again. He felt the soft fabric of her blouse and her ribs moving as she breathed. After a few moments he pulled away and asked, "Where is he? I came all the way from Minnesota to find him." Walter translated, but the old woman seemed lost in thought. "What do you know about him?" she finally wrote. Ben spoke in a rush, but Walter kept up with him. "I don't know anything about him. My mom never talked about him. After she died, I found Wonderstruck in the note on the bookmark. That's how I learned his name was Daniel and that he lived in New York." Ben explained about going to his apartment and ending up at the museum and finding the wolf diorama and the files. "I read a letter he wrote to my mom, so I know that he used to work in the museum, and that he made the diorama, and that they must have met when he came to Minnesota to do research. But that's all I know." When Walter finished signing for Rose, she signed back. Then she nodded and wrote, "I will answer all your questions, Ben, as best as I can. But first, tell me if you've eaten." Ben shook his head. He had almost forgotten how hungry he was. Walter went into the back and returned with a sandwich and a cup of orange juice, as well as a plate full of pretzels, which Ben ate quickly. After Walter had taken the dishes back to the office, he and Rose signed something, and then she wrote, "I want to answer your questions, but I can't do it here. We have to take a subway ride. It's a long trip. Are you up for it?" "Yes," Ben said. "But why can't you tell me here?" Rose read his lips and squeezed his shoulders. Her face looked sad and complicated. Ben understood that the only thing he could do was follow her and wait for her to tell him what he wanted to know. "Are you ready?" Ben rubbed his smooth silver locket around his neck and nodded. He was ready. They entered the lobby of the museum, and Rose turned on the lights, motioning for Ben to sit down on a bench. It was hot and stuffy inside. Rose sat behind Ben, then retrieved Ben's notebook and pen from her bag. "It's going to take me a long time to write this story for you. I need you to be patient with me, okay? I've never written this all down for anyone." A story? Ben didn't want a story. He wanted to meet his dad. Still, he nodded and continued, reading as fast as she wrote, line after line, in the notebook. "I've worked here for 15 years, but the story I need to tell you begins a long time before that. When I was little, I could see New York from my window, but my parents never let me go there. Too dangerous for a deaf girl to leave the house, they said. So, as a child, I used to write little notes and send them out into the world because I felt so alone. I ran away from home many times, and it was Walter who finally rescued me. I found him at the American Museum of Natural History." Ben tapped Rose's shoulder and pointed to AMNH. He didn't know what that was. American Museum of Natural History. "Of course," Ben nodded for her to go on. "I knew Walter had gotten his first job selling books at the museum as part of a new exhibition." Ben tapped Rose. He mimed opening a book and mouthed the word "Wonderstruck." Rose nodded. "I was 12 when I ran away to New York. Walter found me while I was hiding in an exhibition room. Later he took me to his apartment and gave me the book. I love museums and cabinets of wonders ever since. I begged him to help me, to get me out of the house, away from our father. I wanted to stay in New York City. I wanted to learn things. At Walter's apartment, I remember gazing out at a gigantic buildings at night. They were so beautiful. I had spent so much time looking at the city from across the water in Hoboken that I was ecstatic to finally be in the middle of it. Walter helped find me a school for deaf children. I didn't even know such a thing existed. Our parents were married when my mother was very young. She gave birth to Walter when she was only 17. I came along 8 years later, and soon after that my parents divorced. It was a very big scandal back then, because my mother was famous. One day, I'll show you my scrapbook. Our parents resisted letting me go, but my brother fought with them and convinced them I needed to be at a good boarding school where everyone was deaf. Until I went back to school, I had never met another deaf person. I didn't know it, but this is what I had been waiting for. There were so many people like me. Unfortunately, I didn't like our classes because we were forced to lip read and speak, which I hated to do, and was never good at it before I went to school. I had a lip reading and speech tutor at home, but I hated him. Once, I cut up his big book and turned it into paper buildings so I wouldn't have to practice. But the other students taught me how to sign when we were not in class. And the world opened up. I discovered I could really communicate and make jokes. I never knew how much fun it was to make jokes and laugh with other people. I was never happier. At that same school, I met the boy who would become your grandfather, Bill Lobo. He was the handsomest boy in my class, strong, good at sports. Like so many of our classmates, he worked with big machines on a printing press. Deaf people aren't bothered by the noise, of course, so in those days, many of the deaf boys learned how to be printers. I, too, needed a job after I graduated. Walter helped me get to work at the American Museum of Natural History, in the exhibitions department. I'd always loved making things with my hands, and I was so happy to work there, helping to create miniatures of Indian pueblos, Mexican villages, and Arabian cities. Bill and I got married after we finished school. Many people, especially our parents, thought it was a bad idea for two deaf people to get married. Everyone worried we would pass our deafness on to our children. But Bill became deaf from an illness when he was 9 years old, and no one was sure how or when exactly I became deaf. It might have been how I was born, although my father, a doctor, always said it happened when I was 2 and I had a bad fall. Bill's parents, like mine, had a hard time coping with a deaf child. He had 5 older siblings, all of whom could hear, so no one paid him much attention. But at school, he blossomed just as much as I did. When I became pregnant, I wondered what it would be like to have a deaf baby. I knew we could give him the upbringing we had missed before we got to our school. But it isn't easy being deaf, and we were happy Danny could hear. That just made everyone even more worried, though. How could two deaf people raise a hearing baby? Our parents pointed out that we couldn't hear a deaf baby or a hearing crying baby at night. Even worse to them, they worried the baby would never learn to speak. Well, it was hard, but with the help of friends, the voices on the radio, which we left on all the time, and yes, even our parents, we did it, and we loved Danny more than anything. Rose paused and massaged her writing hand as Ben caught up. Everything seemed to vanish for him except the pen, the paper, and the story. Even though he could hear, I don't think it was easy for Danny. In many ways, he ended up in the same position Bill and I were in growing up. We were so different from our parents. But Danny became a child of 2 worlds, the hearing and the deaf. He could sign so beautifully, better than many deaf people. Once he was old enough, he sometimes had to act as an interpreter for us out in the world, translating between sign language and spoken language. But he never complained. He was a happy child, and happiest when he was drawing. He loved to paint pictures of animals, and he built the most wonderful little sculptures. He often came to the museum with me when he was growing up. He'd sit next to me in the model-making department, working on his own little projects while I worked on mine. The staff members gave Danny the run of the place and taught him about every aspect of the museum. Soon he had fallen in love with the geography and science and math, as well as art. They let him play in the half-finished dioramas in the storage rooms. Ben's hand went into his pocket and he carefully pulled out the seashell turtle. Rose's eyes grew wide when he handed it to her, and he could tell from her expression that she knew exactly what it was. She turned it over in her palm before returning it to Ben. He took the notebook and pen. My mom gave me the turtle when I was going into 3rd grade. She used to call me Turtle because I was shy. She never told me it was from my dad. Rose smiled and took back the pen and notebook. After the Wonderstruck exhibition closed, they were going to tear it down, but they never got around to it. As the years went by, the room collected dust and slowly it turned into a storage room. Your dad used to hide inside the cabinet, which is where he found the seashell turtle. He loved that turtle and used to carry it around in his pocket. Ben smiled, imagining his father giving the turtle one cold winter's night to his mom. Returning it to his own pocket, he gestured for Rose to continue the story. She drew an arrow going back to the words, the half-finished dioramas in the storage rooms, and then went on. The staff showed Danny what went into creating every aspect of the dioramas. The museum was one place he wanted to work when he grew up, and once he was old enough, they were eager to hire him. We were so proud. I worked there for many years, several of them alongside Danny, but in 1962, planning was underway for the 1964 World's Fair, which was to be held in Queens. Countries from all over the world would be participating. There were going to be shows, rides, and all sorts of attractions. One of those attractions was going to be a scale model of the entire city of New York, all 5 boroughs, all 895,000 buildings. It would be almost 10,000 square feet, the largest architectural model ever built. They named it the Panorama, and they needed people to create and glue down all the buildings and carve the parks and hills. When I found out about a job opening, I jumped at the chance to take it. It was sad to leave the American Museum of Natural History after so many wonderful years, but I couldn't say no. As a child dreaming about New York, I'd built the city out of paper in my room, so in a way, I had been preparing for this job my entire life. I worked on the model of New York for 2 years. I made hundreds of tiny buildings, apartment towers, museums, stores. It was heaven. Rose stopped to rub her hand again. Then she got up, took Ben's hand, and led him into a dark, cavernous space. She pressed a few buttons in a control panel hidden in the wall, and suddenly a giant spotlight lit up the room. The panorama was one of the most wondrous things Ben had ever seen. As they slowly walked around the perimeter, he just stared, taking in all the glorious details. When they reached the top of the ramp that surrounded the model, Rose stopped to write again. A few years after it was built, the 1964 World's Fair was closed and dismantled, but they decided to keep the panorama on display because it was so popular. They needed someone to maintain the model and update it, to build tiny versions of all the new buildings in New York as they went up, and take away the old ones as they were torn down. They offered me the job. Around them, the room began to grow dim. Ben looked at Rose, worried. She smiled. Every 15 minutes, night falls, she explains. 10 million tiny windows, painted with little dabs of fluorescent paint, lit up across the darkening city. The model glowed magnificently. Rose guided Ben down around the pathway surrounding the model as an artificial morning spread across the miniature city. She wrote the names of all the parts of the city: Manhattan, the Bronx, Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Queens. She pointed out the little version of another holdover from the 1964 World's Fair, the huge silver model of the Earth they'd passed on the way here, called the Unisphere. She showed him the small model of the building they were standing in right now, as well as the skyscrapers and bridges, green rolling parks and twisting black roads, marshes, graveyards, and power plants. Ben felt like a bird flying above the sprawling expanse of New York City. When they came to a doorway Ben hadn't noticed before, Rose took out her key ring, opened the door, and led them through. There was a second door at the bottom of a short set of stairs. Rose led Ben through that as well. Then, like giants, the two of them stepped out onto the Atlantic Ocean. Mid up the East River, after stepping over 3 more bridges, Rose stopped to write. Standing beside her, between Manhattan and Brooklyn, Ben looked away from the notebook and located Central Park, the Museum of Natural History, the Hayden Planetarium, and the Port Authority. Night fell again. Ben noticed how parts of their clothing, the whites of Rose's eyes and teeth, and the paper in his notebook glowed purple in the ultraviolet night. They waited without moving until the electric sun rose once more. Ben looked at the notebook, where Rose continued to write. I loved helping to create this model. Sometimes during those 2 years, I'd stay late into the night after everyone else had left, just so I could be alone with it for a little while. Danny and I would get together, and I'd tell him how progress was going, and he'd tell me about his latest projects. Around that time, he was appointed the lead designer on a new diorama at the American Museum of Natural History, the youngest person to ever have that honor. But you already know this part, Ben. He headed up to Gunflint Lake with 2 other employees of the museum. The 2 other men found Ben pictured his dad staying in the cabin where he and his cousins had played pirates and monsters, and it made him happy to know he'd walk on the same floor and sat on the same chairs as his dad. He spent a lot of time in the area and eventually decided he'd like to focus on the wolves. If you've been through the files, then you've seen many of the drawings. He also sent me some of them, along with wonderful letters. He fell in love with your mom almost immediately. He described her in the most vivid terms. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. He said he always thought librarians were old women in sweaters, but Elaine was very young and beautiful and didn't much care what anyone around her said about her. He used the word radical to describe her, meaning, I think, that she lived completely on her own terms, and he loved that about her. His letters called her independent, unwilling to compromise, a woman of the lake and of books. It was peculiar, thought Ben, to see his own mother described so perfectly by someone he'd never met. But they both knew it couldn't work out. Elaine wouldn't leave Gunflint Lake, and Danny wouldn't move out of New York. He said he always had the sense that Elaine didn't need a husband or want one. She said she had everything she needed on the lake and in the library. He did think there was something lonely about her, although he wasn't sure what it was she was missing. When Danny finished his research on Gunflint Lake, he came back to New York broken-hearted. I think he'd been the happiest when he was there, working on the diorama, falling in love with your mom. Rose stopped writing for a moment, and Ben didn't breathe until her pen started moving again. Eventually, he completed the diorama of the wolves, the only one he got to make. I still go visit it whenever I can. I saw you there, wrote Ben, the other day. Rose looked surprised. Why didn't my dad get to make more dioramas? Ben continued. But even as he wrote this, he began to understand what the answer had to be. Rose paused and looked into Ben's eyes before taking the pen from him. Your dad was ill, Ben. He had a heart condition. I don't know if he told your mother. It kept him out of the war, which I was happy about, but a few years after he felt Rose reach her arms around him and draw him in. She held him for a long time, and neither of them moved, except for the rise and fall of their chests as they breathed. Ben could tell Rose was crying too. After a while, Ben wiped his eyes and said, "Did he know about me?" Rose read his lips. "I don't know. I don't think so. But I do know he would have loved you if he had. He adored children. He used to lead tours around the museum for school groups." Rose brushed the hair from Ben's forehead and wiped the tears from his cheek. Ben took the pen. "But you said you met me before." "If my dad didn't know me, how did you?" "We're not at the end of the story, Ben. There's something else I want to share with you now. A secret." Rose paused, and Ben moved a little closer to her, waiting anxiously for her to continue. "This panorama isn't just a model of the city. It's also the story of your father. That's why I brought you here." Ben looked out across the endless expanse of miniature buildings. He returned his gaze to the notebook, where Rose continued to write. "When I took the job here, I thought it would be for fun to secretly personalize the panorama. So I collected things that had belonged to your father, little mementos from his childhood mostly, and I hid them inside buildings all across the model. Maybe there was part of me, knowing his heart was weak, that wanted something of him to always be here. That's not how I thought of it at the time, though. I just loved your father and wanted to do this for him and for myself. When I told him about my little project, he helped me curate it and gave me more things to put into it. In a way, this model tells the story of your father's life in New York. It was like we were making our own cabinet of wonders." Ben remembered reading about curators in Wonderstruck, and thought about what it meant to curate your own life, and his dad had done here. What would it be like to pick and choose the objects and stories that would go into your own cabinet? How would Ben curate his own life? And then thinking about his museum box, in his house, in his books, and the secret room, he realized he'd already begun doing it. Maybe, thought Ben, we are all cabinets of wonders. "Here's the hospital where your father was born." Rose pointed to a tiny gray brick building. "Inside, I placed a photograph of me and Bill. I hid one of his pencils there." Rose continued to point around the model, all across Manhattan into Brooklyn and Queens, as she told Ben the story of his father's life and explained each of the little artifacts she'd hidden in the places that had been so important to him. A lucky penny he found in Central Park was now under the small version of the rectangular green park. A silver charm he'd won at Coney Island rested under the miniature wonder wheel that Rose had built. And one of his baby teeth was hidden inside the grocery store where he'd lost it many years ago. Night descended again across the giant room. Ben noticed a tiny airplane taking off from a tiny airport nearby. It flew to the ceiling on a nearby invisible wire looped overhead across the city, and then came in for a landing. A few moments later it flew up and repeated the journey. When day came again, the model was no longer an endless expanse of unknown buildings. It opened up and came to life around Ben, and for a few moments it was as if his father came to life around him too. Ben looked at the model of the Museum of Natural History. He tapped Rose's shoulder. "What is inside that?" She motioned for him to follow her around the southern tip of Manhattan. They stepped back over the Williamsburg Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, and the Brooklyn Bridge, and headed up the other side of the island along the Hudson River until they were standing on the blue-painted water that separated Manhattan from New Jersey. Rose leaned over the west side of Manhattan, gripped the model of the museum, and pulled upward. There was a little resistance, but it gave way. Rose turned the building over and picked out two pieces of paper. She unfolded the first one and handed Ben a drawing of the wolves that looked just like the ones in the museum files. This is one of the drawings Danny sent me." She unfolded the other piece of paper. It was a crude child's drawing, but it was recognizable as the wolf diorama. To his astonishment, it was signed Ben. "When your dad died, we had the memorial service at the museum. I knew everyone except for two people, a woman and a little boy who was around 4. The woman introduced herself to me using sign language and said her name was Elaine. She told me Danny had been a friend of hers some years ago and had explained that his parents were both deaf. He taught her a little sign language." Ben marveled at the idea of his mother knowing sign language. She'd never shared it with him, although now that he thought about it, there had been a few times he'd seen her alone on the couch, not knowing she was being watched, moving her hands through the air. Had she been secretly signing to Danny? "I knew exactly who she was from the letters. She introduced me to her son, and I was struck by how much the boy looked like Danny when Danny was young. She told me that she'd brought her son to the museum early, and they'd visited the diorama Danny made. Of course that boy was you. She squeezed her hand, and you reached into your pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, which you handed to me. I unfolded it and started to cry. You had drawn the wolves and said I could keep it." Ben remembered none of this, but in some strange way it all made sense. His need to collect things, his interest in museums, the wolf dreams. It all came into focus, sort of like one of those Polaroid pictures from Jamie's camera. Ben's dreams hadn't come from nowhere. He'd been dreaming of his father's wolves, which he'd seen. He thought about his past few dreams, how silent they were, and how he couldn't tell if the wolves were behind him anymore. Finally he understood that all this time the wolves hadn't been chasing him. They'd been guiding him, leading him onward, through the snow, to his father. As Rose folded the two pieces of paper and slipped them back into the tiny museum, Ben reached into his pocket and took out the seashell turtle. "Can this go in there too?" Rose read his lips and smiled. Ben set the turtle gently on her palm, and carefully she placed it inside the museum along with the two other treasures. She returned the museum to the panorama and continued to write. "Elaine never said that you were Danny's son, but Bill and I couldn't help but wonder. I remembered Danny's descriptions of her, and it made sense that even if she didn't want a husband, she might still want a child. Maybe that was the one thing she had been missing, you." Ben blinked and took a deep breath. If his mom understood how it felt to be missing something, he thought, why wouldn't she talk to him about the one thing he had been missing? Was she afraid that he'd want to leave the lake like Danny? Was it hard for her to watch her son collect things and discover an interest in museums, and have so much in common with his dad? She must have thought she was protecting him, or protecting herself from losing him. Either way, Ben felt he understood it now. "Your mother kept to herself, but Bill and I couldn't stop thinking about you. So one night we snuck in here and hid your drawing inside the museum." Ben tapped Rose and mouthed the words. "Where is Bill?" Rose touched Ben's hand for a moment before writing. "He died 2 years ago. I wish you had known each other. He was funny. He liked to play practical jokes. He loved to read. He was proud of the printing press he worked on, and he loved Danny. He would have loved you so much." Rose shook her head and seemed to laugh a little to herself. "Oh, Ben, all this time I've wondered if it was true. If we really had a grandson. If you were really Danny's son." Ben reached up and moved his hand slowly across Rose's cheek. It was odd to touch his grandmother's face, almost as if her skin were somehow a part of his own face and his father's. He thought about how much he missed his mom's touch. Ben still didn't know if she had planned this trip to New York, or if it was just an accident that he'd found the book and the bookmark and his grandmother. And that's when it hit him. "What is today's date?" he wrote. "July 13th. Why? Tomorrow is my birthday." Rose's eyes sparkled. "Will you teach me sign language?" Ben wrote. Rose raised her right hand and moved her fist up and down several times as she nodded. Ben understood and laughed. "Thank you for being so brave," Rose wrote. "Your parents..." The room was suddenly plunged into complete darkness. The ultraviolet lights didn't come on, and everything was submerged in black. Ben felt a terrible panic rise up in him. What had happened? Except for the touch of his grandmother's hand and the floor beneath his feet, everything in the world seemed to disappear. Ben tried to visualize the tiny city spread out around him. One wrong move, and they would crush a bridge or destroy an entire city block. He worried about falling, or worse, Rose falling. How would he get help? Rose tightened her grip and slowly urged Ben along. Inch by inch, they moved as if they were struggling beneath a black velvet blanket. For a split second, a distant flash of lightning lit the entrance to the panorama, which opened out to the front doors of the museum. A storm must have begun. Ben shuddered and prayed the building would not be hit. Rose and Ben shuffled along with tiny footsteps, careful to stay on the river. Ben wiped his feet with his t-shirt. Arms extended, they continued to walk through the thick darkness, being careful not to crush any bridges or buildings. After what felt like hours, they bumped into a wall. They groped along it until, with the help of another flash of lightning, Ben located the door. One step at a time, they made their way up the dark stairs and onto the walkway surrounding the panorama. In the distance, lightning flashed again from the entrance. It grew brighter as they exited the panorama and headed toward the lobby. Blood pounded in Ben's head. He clutched Rose as a dazzling blast illuminated the lobby and left a glowing aftershock that hurt his eyes. After a few moments, the lightning stopped. Ben's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and at last he understood. There was no storm, and there was no lightning. It was Jamie on the other side of the glass door, holding his camera and waving madly. Ben knew at once he must have been trying to get their attention with the camera flash, since banging on the door obviously hadn't worked. A pile of developing photographs lay at his feet. Ben rushed to the door and motioned for Rose to open it. Night had fallen, but the street lamps were dark, and the light above the entrance had failed to come on. Rose fished the key from her bag and opened the door. Jamie looked at Rose, and a moment of confusion passed across his face before he threw his arms around Ben. "How did you get here?" asked Ben. "I followed you," mouthed Jamie. Rose pulled the boys away from the door and relocked it. She slowly led them through long hallways, up dark stairs, and to Ben's surprise, out onto the roof. They sat near the edge of the building and caught their breath. A warm breeze blew gently through their hair as they turned and looked across the river to Manhattan. To Ben's amazement, the blackout extended across the entire city. The skyline looked like a miniature silhouette. The only difference between the actual city in front of them and the panorama they'd left behind seemed to be the sky that arched magnificently above them. Jamie looked from Ben to Rose and back again. Ben could see him trying to talk to Rose, but she was reaching into her bag and didn't notice. She pulled out Ben's notebook and pen and wrote something, which he handed to Jamie with a curious smile. The words were just invisible in the moonlight. "Who are you?" Ben read the notebook over Jamie's shoulder and said to him, "I think I can answer." Ben could feel the letters vibrating on his fingers. My friend. Jamie smiled, and then fingers spelled his name for Rose. She shook his hand. This is Rose, my grandmother, Ben told Jamie. Jamie's jaw dropped. He smiled his crooked grin, and Ben could tell he wasn't sure if Ben was joking. Really? He mouthed. Ben flipped through the notebook and showed Jamie the pages that Rose had written for him. Later you will read this. It explains everything. As he said these words, Ben realized how true they were. Not only did the notebook contain the story of his dad and his grandparents, but also the story he'd written for Jamie about his mom, and his aunt and uncle and cousins, and Jamie's story about his parents, the museum, and bits and pieces of almost all their conversations. Thinking about all the connections that led him here, Ben marveled at how everything could be traced, like a path on a treasure map, from a book, a turtle, and a cabinet in an old exhibition, to Walter, to Rose, to Danny, to Elaine, and then finally to Ben himself. And of course Ben would never have discovered the path in the first place if it weren't for Jamie. The world was full of wonders. Ben asked Jamie, Does your dad know where you are? Jamie shook his head. He's going to worry about you. Ben turned to a blank page and wrote, How long will the blackout last? Jamie forgot to tell his dad where he was going. Rose read it and looked for a moment at Jamie. My brother knows where we are, she answered. He'll come get us in his car and we'll take you home. It'll be okay. All we can do right now is wait. Ben put his arm on Jamie's shoulder and Jamie smiled. Ben looked out at the jagged skyline and wondered what happened in a city without electricity. He'd been scared during the blackout in Minnesota when he was trapped by the storm in his house. But it had given him the chance to read Wonderstruck by flashlight in his mom's bed. Ben imagined all of New York City reading by flashlight in their beds, and he marveled over how much had happened from blackout to blackout. Ben was sure his aunt and uncle had been called by now, but he hoped he wouldn't have to go back to Gunflint Lake right away. Rose had introduced him to the panorama as well as to his father's life, and now he was ready to explore the city itself. Maybe he could stay with his grandmother for a while, or maybe, like Jamie, he could come for the summers. Whatever happened, Ben knew that he belonged here,